I followed Ani out into a sitting area in the garden, full of questions. "Where did Tashi's father go?" I asked. "He's getting ready for the transition," she replied, glancing back at me. "This may not be easy. We may all be displaced for a while. There are many who are coming back from the temples and helping." I shook my head. "What do you think will happen?" "No one knows," she replied. "The legends are not specific. All we know is that there will be a transition." The uncertainty began to diminish my energy level again, and I sat down on one of the benches nearby. Ani followed and sat beside me. "I do know what you must do," she said. "You must continue to pursue the rest of the fourth extension. Everything else will take care of itself." I nodded half-heartedly. "Focus on what you have learned here. You have seen how technology must evolve, and you have now begun to see how our culture focuses itself on the life process, the miracle of birth and conscious evolution. You know that this is the focus that creates the most inspiration and the most fun. The materialistic life in the outer cultures pales when compared to it. We are spiritual beings, and our lives must revolve around the mysteries of family and talent and the search for individual mission." "But I haven't seen it all," I said. She looked deeply into my eyes. "No, you must continue to understand the rest of the fourth extension. There is more. Your prayer field can become more powerful yet." At that moment, we could hear the helicopters again, and the sound of them filled me with anger. They seemed to be getting closer. How was this possible? How could they know where Shambhala was? "Damn them," I said, which produced a horrified look on Ani's face. "You have much anger," she said. "Well, it's hard not to be angry when you realize what the Chinese military is doing." "This anger is a pattern in you. I'm sure you have been warned of its effect." I thought back to all Yin had tried to explain. "Yes, I have. I just keep messing up." I could tell she was concerned. "You will have to master this problem," she said. "But don't get down on yourself too much. You must keep the problem in mind. Remind yourself. Stay conscious. And at the same time, set your prayer field that you will break through and discard the old pattern." I knew that was a very fine line to walk and would take conscious work on my part. "What should I do now?" I asked. "What do you think?" "I've got to go to the temples?" "Is that your intuition?" I thought again about my dream and finally told her about it. Her eyes grew wide. "You dreamed of going to the temples with Tashi?" she asked. "Yeah," I replied. "Well, don't you think you should tell him about it?" she said sternly. I walked up to Tashi's room and touched the wall. "Come in," he said, and an opening appeared. Tashi was stretched out on his bed. He immediately sat up and gestured to a chair across from him. I sat down. For a moment he was silent, the weight of the world on his shoulders. Finally he said, "I still don't know what to do." "What are you thinking?" I asked. "I don't know. I'm confused. All I can think of is getting to the outer cultures. My mother says I must find my own way. I wish my grandmother was here." "Where is your grandmother?" "She's at the temples, somewhere." We stared at each other for a long time, and then he added, "If only I could understand this dream I had." I sat straight up. "What dream?" "I'm with another group of people. I can't see their faces, but I know that one of them is my sister." He paused for a moment. "I could also see a place with water. Somehow I'd gotten to the outer cultures." "I've had a dream too," I said. "You were with me. We were at one of the temples. It was blue, and we found someone else there." A trace of a smile crossed Tashi's face. "What are you saying?" he asked. "That I'm supposed to go to the temples instead of to the outer cultures?" "No," I said, "that's not what I mean. You told me that everyone thinks it's impossible to get to the outer cultures through the temples. But what if it's not?" His face lit up. "You mean go to the temples and try to get to the outer cultures from there?" I just looked at him. "That must be it," he said, standing up. "Perhaps I have been called after all." No sooner had we walked out of the bedroom than the sounds of the helicopters in the distance increased. Ani came into the house and pulled out 3 heavy backpacks from a storage bin. She handed them to us along with 2 parkas. I noticed that they seemed to have been conventionally made with cloth and stitching. I was about to ask about them, but she quickly ushered us out of the dwelling and led us down the path to our left. As we walked, Ani moved up beside Tashi, and I could hear him telling her about his decision to go to the temples. The rumblings from the helicopters were coming ever closer, and the blue sky had now turned into a thick overcast. At one point, I asked her where we were heading. "To the caves," she said. "You'll need some time to prepare." We walked down a rocky path which traversed the side of a sheer cliff and onto a plateau on the other side. Here, Ani waved us into a small gully, where we huddled, listening. The helicopters moved in a small circle over the cliffs for a moment and followed our path exactly until they were directly over us. Ani looked horrified. "What's happening?" I yelled. Without answering, she climbed out of the gully and motioned for us to follow. We ran perhaps half a mile across the plateau and into another hilly area, and then stopped and waited. As before, the helicopters circled behind us until they arrived directly overhead. A gust of frigid air hit us, almost knocking me over. At the same time, all of the clothes disappeared from our bodies except for the heavy coats. "I thought this might happen," Ani said, pulling more clothes from the packs. I still had my boots on, but Tashi's and Ani's had disappeared. She gave him a pair made of leather and put on another herself. When we finished, we made our way up the slope, climbing between the rocks until we arrived at a flatter area. A heavy snow shower was beginning and the temperature was falling. The helicopters seemed to have lost their way for the moment. I looked out on the once green valley. Snow had covered almost everything, and the plants already seemed to be withering from the cold. "It's the effect of the soldiers' energy," Ani said. "It is destroying our environmental field." Glancing toward the sound of the helicopters, I felt a new surge of anger. They banked immediately and headed straight toward us. "Let's go!" Ani shouted. I moved up closer to the small fire, feeling the morning chill. We had walked for another hour and spent the night in a small cave. In spite of several layers of insulated undergarments, I was still freezing. Tashi was now huddled up beside me, and Ani was looking out through the opening at the frozen world outside. The snow had been falling for hours. "It's all gone now," Ani said. "There's nothing out there now but ice." I moved over to the opening and looked out. What was once a wooded valley with hundreds of dwellings was now nothing but snow and jagged mountains. Here and there were the bent-over remains of trees, but not a spot of color could be seen. All the houses had simply vanished, and the river that ran through the center of the valley was frozen over. "The temperature must have fallen 60 degrees, Ani said. "What happened?" I asked. "When the Chinese found us, the power of their thoughts and their expectations of frigid weather counteracted the field that we had set to keep the temperature moderate. Ordinarily, the strength of the fields provided by those of the temples would have been strong enough to have kept the Chinese away altogether, but they knew it was time for the transition." "What? They let them in on purpose?" "It was the only way. If you and the others who have found us were allowed in, there was no way to keep out the soldiers. You are not strong enough to keep all negative thoughts out of your mind, and the Chinese have followed you here." "You mean this is my fault?" I said. "It's okay. It is part of the dispersal." I wasn't consoled. I moved back to the fire, and Ani followed. Tashi had prepared a stew of dried vegetables. "You must realize," she said, "that everything is all right with the people of Shambhala. All this was expected. Everyone who was here is fine. Enough people came back from the temples to take them through the spatial windows to a new place of safety. Our legends have prepared us well." She pointed out toward the valley. "You must focus on what you're doing. You and Tashi have to make it to the temples without being captured by the military. The rest of what Shambhala has been doing for humanity must be known." She stopped as we both heard the faint rumblings of a distant helicopter. The sound grew fainter and finally disappeared. And you must be much more careful," she said. "I thought you knew not to allow negative images into your mind, especially hateful or disparaging thoughts." I knew she was right, but I still felt confused about how all that worked. She looked hard at me. "Sooner or later, you're going to have to deal with your pattern of anger." I was about to ask a question when out through the cave opening we saw several dozen people walking down an icy slope to our right. Ani stood up and looked at Tashi. "There is no more time," she said. "I have to go. I have to help these people find a way out. Your father will be waiting on me." She walked toward the mouth of the cave and turned around to face both of us. "You will be fine," she said. "But be careful. You cannot keep your energy up if you are overwhelmed with anger. You must have no enemies." She stopped and looked at me, and then said something I had heard many times on this journey. "And remember," she instructed, smiling, "you are being helped." Tashi looked over his shoulder and smiled at me as we trudged through the deep snow. It was getting colder, and I struggled to maintain my energy. To reach the mountain range holding the temples, we had to climb down the ridge we were on, cross the frozen valley, and climb almost straight up and over another mountain. For 2 hours we made our way across the valley floor, crossing the frozen river and working our way up the gradual slope to the base of the steep mountains. The snow was beginning to fall harder. Suddenly, Tashi stopped. "Something moved up ahead," he said. I strained to see. What was it? It looked like a person. "Come on." We proceeded up the slope of the mountain. Its peak looked to be about 2,000 feet above us. "There has to be a pass somewhere," Tashi said. "We can't go over the top." Ahead of us we heard the sound of sliding snow and rocks. Tashi and I glanced at each other and moved slowly around a series of large outcroppings. As we made our way past the last one, we could see a man shaking himself out of the snow. He looked exhausted. A bloody bandage was wrapped around one of his knees. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was Will. "It's okay," I said to Tashi. "I know this man." I stood up and crawled over the rocks. Will heard us and dived to the side, ready in spite of his leg to run down a narrow draw away from us. "It's me," I called to him. Will stood up tall for a moment, then collapsed again in the snow. He was dressed in a thick white parka and insulated pants. "It's about time," he said, smiling. "I was expecting you earlier." Tashi rushed over and looked at Will's leg. I introduced them. As quickly as I could, I explained to Will everything that had happened to me. Meeting Yen, fleeing the Chinese, learning the extensions, getting through the gateway, and finally, reaching the rings of Shambhala. "I didn't know how to find you," I added, pointing down the valley. "Everything's been ruined. It's the effect of the Chinese." "I know," Will said. "I've already run into them myself." Will went on to tell us about his experiences. Like me, he had extended his prayer field the best he could and been allowed into Shambhala. He'd been in another part of the rings, where he was educated further in the legends by another family. "The temples are very difficult to reach," Will said, "especially now with the Chinese soldiers coming. We must make sure we are not engaging in negative prayer." "I don't seem to be doing so well in that area," I replied. He looked at me sharply, concerned. "But that's why you were with Yen. Didn't he show you what can happen?" "I think I understand how to avoid the general fear images. It's my anger against the Chinese soldiers that keeps slipping me up." Will looked even more alarmed and was about to say something when we heard the sounds of helicopters closing in the distance. We began our climb up the mountain, weaving our way through the rocks and deep snowbanks. Will stopped and dropped to one knee. "Listen," he said. "What's that?" "It's the helicopter again," I said, fighting my irritation. As we listened, the helicopter sliced through the overhanging clouds and began to fly straight toward us. Limping slightly, Will made his way farther up the icy slope, but I paused for an instant, hearing something else above the noise of the helicopter. It sounded like a freight train. "Look out!" Will screamed from ahead of me. "It's an avalanche!" I tried to run out of the way, but it was too late. The full force of the rolling snow hit me in the face and knocked me backward down the slope. I was tumbling and sliding, sometimes covered completely by the weight of the thundering avalanche, sometimes riding on the surface of the moving mass. After what seemed like forever, I felt myself come to a stop. I was packed in, unable to move, my body in a contorted position under the snow. I tried to suck in a breath, but there was no air. I knew I was about to die. But someone grabbed my outstretched arm and began to dig me out. I could feel others digging around me, and finally my head was free. I gasped for air, wiping the snow from my eyes, expecting to see Will. Instead, I saw a dozen Chinese soldiers. I stood, looking out a porthole-sized window of a 30 by 30-foot insulated tent. Altogether, I could count at least 7 large tents and 3 small, portable trailers of a size that could be airlifted easily. A gasoline generator hummed at the corner of the compound, and I could see several helicopters sitting in an area to the left. The snow had stopped falling, but had accumulated 12 or 14 inches on the ground. I strained to see to the right. From the lay of the mountain range in the background, I concluded that I had been flown only as far back as the center of the valley. A nighttime wind howled, flapping the outside seams of the tent. When I had arrived, I had been fed, forced to take a lukewarm shower, and given warm Chinese fatigues and insulated underwear to put on. At least I was finally warm. I turned around and looked over at the armed Chinese guard sitting at the entrance. His eyes had been following my every move with a cold, icy stare that chilled my soul. Fatigued, I walked over and sat down on one of the 2 army cots in the corner. I tried to assess my situation, but I couldn't think. I was numb, petrified, so fearful, in fact, that I knew I wasn't very alert. I couldn't understand why I felt so incapacitated. It was a panic as intense as any I had ever experienced. I tried to take a deep breath and build energy, but I couldn't even get started. The bare light bulbs hanging from the tent ceiling filled the room with a dull, flickering light and ominous shadows. I could find no beauty anywhere around me. The flap of the tent opened up, and the soldier stood up at attention. Colonel Chang walked in and took off his thick parka, nodding to the guard. He then focused on me. I looked away. "We must talk," he said, pulling a folding chair over and sitting 4 feet away. "I must have the answers to my questions. Now." He stared at me coldly for a moment. "Why are you here?" I decided to answer as truthfully as I could. "I'm here studying Tibetan legend. I told you that." "You're here looking for Shambhala." I was silent. "Is that it?" he asked. "Is it in this valley?" The fear churned in my stomach. What would he do if I refused to answer? "Don't you know?" I asked. He smiled slightly. "I would guess that you and the rest of your illegal sect think this is Shambhala." He looked puzzled, as though remembering something else. "We've glimpsed other people here, but they have managed to elude us in the snow. Where are they? Where did they go?" "I don't know," I said. "I don't even know where we are." He shifted toward me. "We have also found the remains of plants recently alive. How is that possible? How could they have grown here?" I just stared. He grinned coldly. "How much do you really know about the legends of Shambhala?" A little," I stammered. "I know a lot." "Do you believe that?" "By now, I've had access to all the ancient writings, and I must say they are delightfully interesting as mythology. Think about it. An ideal community made up of enlightened human beings that are far more advanced mentally than any other culture on this planet. And I know the rest, too. This idea that these individuals of Shambhala somehow have a secret power for good that permeates all the rest of humanity and pushes them in that direction. Fascinating stuff, don't you think? Ancient lore that could even be appreciated, for that matter, if it weren't so misleading and dangerous to the people of Tibet. Don't you think if anything like that were real, we would have discovered it by now? God, spirit, it's all a childish dream. What do you believe in? I asked, trying to defuse the situation. He pointed to his head. I believe in the powers of the mind. This is why you should talk to me. Help us. We are most interested in the idea of psychic power, the greater range of brainwaves and their effect on electronics and people at a distance. But don't confuse this with spiritualism. The powers of mind are a natural phenomenon that can be researched and discovered scientifically. He was looking at me, but something attracted my attention along the wall of the tent behind him, directly across from the door where the guard was standing. The area had suddenly gotten brighter. The light bulb overhead flickered slightly, and I dismissed my perception as a surge from the generator. The colonel got up and walked a few steps toward me, looking more angry. We are going to enlarge this camp until we have enough troops to cover this whole area on foot. Whoever is here will be found and dealt with very harshly. He forced a half-smile. But our friends will be equally rewarded. Do you understand? At this moment, another wave of fear rushed through me, but it was different. It was a fear mixed with a great disdain. I was beginning to loathe the extent of this man's evil. I glanced behind him to the area that seemed lighter, but it was now flat and filled with shadows. The lightness had disappeared, and I felt totally alone. Why are you doing this? I asked. The Tibetan people have a right to their own religious beliefs. You're trying to destroy their culture. How can you do this? I could feel my anger making me stronger. My confrontation seemed only to energize him. Oh, you do have opinions, he smirked. Too bad they are so naive. You think what we are doing is unusual. Your own government is developing ways of controlling you too. Chips that can be inserted into the body of troops and unsuspecting troublemakers. And that's not all. He was almost shouting now. We know now that when people think, a specific pattern of brainwaves radiates outward. Every government is working on machines that can identify these brainwaves, especially angry or anti-government sentiment. His statement chilled me. The direction, the values of society must be controlled and directed for the greater good. That's why this Shambhala legend is so dangerous. It is based on absolute self-direction. As he talked, I thought I heard the door open behind me, but I didn't turn around. I was focused totally on this man's attitude. Here was the worst of modern tyranny being voiced, and the more he talked, the more my loathing increased. What you don't see, I said, is that humans can find an inner motivation to create good in the world. He laughed cynically. Surely you don't believe that. Nothing in history would suggest that people are anything other than selfish and greedy. If you had your own spirituality, you would see the good. My voice was rising in anger, too. No, he snapped, almost screaming. Spirituality is the problem. As long as there is religion, there cannot be unity among people. Don't you understand? Each religious institution is like an inflexible roadblock on the path of progress. Each wars with the other. But don't worry, he went on. We are going to see that the problem is resolved, and you have helped us. Ever since Wilson James visited you in America, we've monitored your movements and the movements of the Dutch group. I knew you would come, that you would be involved. I must have looked surprised. Oh, yes, we have known all about you. We operate more freely in America than you think. Your NSA can monitor the Internet. Do you think we cannot? You and this sect will never elude me. How do you think we could follow you in this weather? It was by power of mind. My mind. It came to me where you would be. Even after we were lost in this wilderness, I knew. I could feel your presence. At first, it was your friend Yin whom I could follow. Now, it's been you. And that's not all. I don't even need to use my instincts to locate you anymore. I have your brainwave scan. He nodded toward the door. In a matter of minutes, Our technicians will have mounted our new surveillance equipment. Then we'll be able to locate anyone we have scanned." At first, I couldn't remember what he was referring to, but then I recalled my experience at the Chinese house in Ali after I was gassed. The soldiers had put me under a machine. A new wave of fear raced through me, but it turned immediately into an even deeper anger. "You're mad!" I screamed. "That's right. To you, I'm crazy, but I'm the future." He was towering over me now, his face red, virtually exploding with anger. "Such stupid innocence! You're going to tell me everything, you understand? Everything!" I knew that he would not have given me all this information if he planned to ever release me, but at the moment, I didn't care. I was talking to a monster, and an overwhelming rage was filling me. I was about to verbalize his damnation again when a voice from the other side of the room called out, "Don't! It weakens you." The colonel turned and stared, and I followed his gaze. There by the door stood another guard, and beside him, slumping against a small table, was Yen. The guard pushed him to the floor. I jumped up and raced over to Yen as the colonel said something in Chinese to the guards, then stormed out. Yen had bruises and cuts on his face. "Yen, are you all right?" I asked, helping him over to a cot. "I'm okay," he said, pulling me down to sit on the cot beside him. "They came for us right after you left." His eyes were full of excitement. "Tell me what happened. Did you reach Shambhala?" I looked at him and held my fingers to my lips. "They probably put us together to see what we would say," I whispered. "You can bet they have this place bugged. We shouldn't talk." "We'll have to risk it for a deeper reason," Yen said. "Come over by the heater. It's noisy. Tell me what happened." For the next half hour, I told him all about the world I had found in Shambhala. Then, in the barest whisper, I mentioned the temples. His eyes grew wider. "So you haven't found all of the fourth extension?" I mouthed, "It's at the temples." I went on to tell him about Tashi and Will, and what Ani had said about learning what those in the temples were doing. "And what else did she say?" Yen asked. "She said we must have no enemies," I replied. Yen grimaced in pain for a moment and then said, "But you are doing exactly that with the colonel. You were using your anger and disdain to feel strong. Those are mistakes I made. You're lucky he did not kill you immediately. You have been expecting him to be evil." "Wait a minute. I was just seeing him the way he is." "Really? What part of him? His ego or his higher soul self?" Yen was right. All this was something I thought I'd learned with the 10th insight, but I wasn't acting on it. When I was running from him, I said, he was able to follow me. He said he could do it with his mind and intuition. "Were you thinking of him?" Yen asked, "expecting him to follow you?" "I must have been." "Don't you remember? That's what was happening with me earlier, and now you are doing the same thing. That expectation was creating the thoughts in Chang's mind of where you were. It was an ego thought, but it came to him because you were expecting, praying, in effect, for him to find you." "Don't you see," Yen continued, "we've talked about this so many times. Our prayer field is working constantly in the world, sending out our expectations, and in the case of another person, the effect is almost instantaneous. This is the hidden process behind your golden rule." I looked at him for a moment, not understanding. I took a minute to remember what he was referring to. The Bible injunction to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. He paused dramatically, then added, "The more complete expression of this rule should be, do unto others the way you would have them do unto you, because how you treat them or think about them is exactly how they are going to treat you. The prayer that you send out with your feeling or action tends to bring out in them exactly what you expect." "But what are we supposed to do?" I protested. "Don't we have to see things as they are?" "Of course we have to see things the way they are. But after that, we must immediately shift our expectations from what is to what could be." He paused dramatically. Do you see how important all this is? Yin asked. You cannot go further with the extensions until you understand this. Anger will always be a temptation. It feels good. It makes our egos think we are becoming stronger. You have to be smarter than that. You cannot reach the strongest levels of creative energy until you can avoid negative prayer of all kinds. There is enough evil out there without adding to it unconsciously. This is the great truth behind the Tibetan code of compassion. I looked away, knowing that all Yin was saying was true. I had slipped into this pattern of anger again. Why did I keep doing this over and over? I awoke with the first noise in the camp. Someone was clanking barrels or large cans together. I jumped up, dressed, and glanced toward the door. The guards had been replaced by 2 other soldiers. They stared at me sleepily. I walked over and looked out the window. The day was dark and overcast, and the wind howled. There was movement in one of the other tents. One of the doors was opening. It was the colonel, and he was walking toward our tent. I moved back to Yin's cot, and he turned over, struggling to wake up. His face was swollen, and he squinted to see me. The colonel is coming back, I said. I will help as much as I can, he said, but you will have to hold a different prayer field for him. It is your only chance. The flap door tore open, and the soldiers jumped to attention. The colonel came in and gestured for them to wait outside. He glanced at Yin once before walking over to me. I was taking deep breaths and attempting to extend my field as much as possible. I visualized the energy flowing out from me, and I focused on seeing him not as a torturer, but only as a soul in fear. I want to know where these temples are, he said, in a low, ominous voice, taking off his coat. The only way you can see them is if your energy is high enough, I replied, voicing the first thing that came to my mind. He seemed to be taken off guard. What are you talking about? You told me you believe in powers of the mind. What if one of those powers is to raise your energy level? What energy? You said that brain waves were real and could be manipulated by a machine. What if they could be manipulated internally by our intention and made stronger, raising your energy level? How is that possible? He said. I couldn't believe it. He seemed to be opening his mind. I focused on the expression on his face that seemed to be honestly considering what I was saying. But it's really possible, I went on. Brainwaves, or perhaps a different set of waves that go farther, can be increased to a point where we can influence what happens. He perked up. Are you telling me you now know how to use brainwaves to make certain things happen? As he talked, I again saw a glow behind him against the wall of the tent. Yes, I continued, but only those things that take our lives in the direction they are supposed to go. Otherwise, the energy eventually collapses. He just stared. Somewhere, deep in his consciousness, he seemed to be understanding. We were interrupted when the guards outside banged on the entrance flap. As they did, I realized that the wind had erupted into a gale. We could hear things being blown and turned over all through the compound. A guard had opened the flap and was shouting loudly in Chinese. The colonel ran toward him. As he did, we could see tents blowing over everywhere. He turned and looked at Yin and me, and in that moment, a tremendous gust of wind blew the left side of our tent up from its foundation and ripped it apart, covering the colonel and guard with canvas, knocking them to the ground. Yin and I were hit with the wind and snow blowing in through the gaping hole. Yin, I shouted, the Dakini! Yin struggled to his feet. This is your chance, he said. Run! Come on, I said, grabbing his arm. We can go together. He pushed me away. I can't. I'll just slow you down. We can make it, I pleaded. He shouted against the howling wind. I've done what I was here to do. Now you must do the same. We still don't know the rest of the 4th extension. I nodded and embraced him quickly, then grabbed the colonel's heavy coat and ran through the hole in the tent into the storm. I ran to the north for about 100 feet and stopped to look back toward the camp. I could still hear the sounds of debris blowing through the compound and the din of shouting. I walked on, hurrying as much as possible in the deep snow. It took me 15 minutes to walk 100 yards. Fortunately, the wind was still fierce, and I knew it would be some time before the Chinese could get their helicopters into the air. I heard a faint sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it gradually became louder. I hunkered down. Someone was calling my name. Finally, I could see someone moving in the blowing snow. It was Will. I embraced him. "God, am I glad to see you. How did you find me?" "I watched the direction the chopper flew in," he said, "and just kept walking until I saw the camp. I've been out here all night. If I hadn't had my camp stove with me, I would have frozen to death. I was trying to figure out how to get you out of there, but the blizzard solved that problem. Come on. We have to try again to get to the temples." "What happened to Tashi?" I asked. "We were separated when the avalanche started," Will replied, "but I saw him later going on up the mountain alone." We walked for more than 2 hours, and strangely, once we got out of the area around the Chinese encampment, the wind began to die down, although it was still snowing heavily. During our trek, I told Will about everything that Yin had said in the tent, and what had happened with the colonel. Finally, we reached the area on the mountain where the avalanche had occurred. We hiked well past it and to the west, farther up the slope. Without talking any more, Will led the way upward for another 2 hours. Finally, he stopped and sat down to rest behind a huge bank of snow. We looked at each other for a long moment, both of us breathing hard. Will smiled and asked, "Do you now understand what Yin was telling you?" I was silent. Even though I had seen it all play out with the colonel, it still seemed hard to believe. "I was engaging in negative prayer," I said finally. "That's how the colonel was able to follow me." "We can go no further until we can both avoid this," Will said. "Our energy must stay consistently high before we can progress through the rest of the fourth extension. We must be very careful not to visualize the evilness of those who are in fear. We have to look at them realistically and take precautions. But if we dwell on their behavior and hold images that they are about to harm us, it sends energy to their paranoia and can actually give them the idea to do whatever it is that we expect. That's why it is so important not to let our minds visualize the bad things that could possibly happen to us. It is a prayer that acts to create that very event." "Where do the legends say we go from here?" I asked. "To the subject I have been most interested in," he replied. "The legends say that we can't expand our fields farther until we fully acknowledge the Dakini." I quickly told him about my many experiences with the strange figures and lighted areas since coming to Tibet. "You had those experiences before Tibet," Will said. He was right. There were times when we were looking for the 10th insight that I seemed to be helped by strange wisps of light. "Yes," I said, remembering the occurrence clearly. "You think that was the Dakini?" Will was standing on his feet, putting on his pack. "Yes," he said. "They are the luminosities we see that guide our way." "What else do the legends say about the Dakini?" I asked. "That they are the same for every culture, every religion, no matter what we call them." I had another question to ask, but Will was hurrying up the slope, avoiding the areas of heavy snow. I followed, dozens of questions coming to my mind. I didn't want to let the conversation go. At one point, Will glanced back at me. "The legends say that these beings have aided humans since the beginning of time, and they are spoken of in the mystical literature of every religion. According to the legends, each of us will begin to perceive them more readily. If we really acknowledge them, the Dakini will make themselves more known." "So if we keep our energy high and acknowledge them," I said, "then we can begin to see more of the luminosities?" "That's right," he said. "The hard part is training ourselves to look for the subtle changes in the light around us. But if we do, we can detect it more." I thought about what he was saying, and I understood, as far as it went, but I still had a question. "What about the cases," I asked, "of Dakini or angels intervening directly in our lives when we aren't expecting them or acknowledging them? This has happened to me." I went on to tell Will about the tall figure that had been there when Yin pushed me out of the jeep north of Ali, and it showed up again when the campfire appeared at the ruined monastery, before I entered Shambhala. Will was nodding. It appears your guardian angel has shown himself. The legends say each of us has one. But what makes them help us at certain times, I asked, and not others? Will raised his eyebrow. That, he said, is the secret we are here to discover. We were reaching the summit of the mountain. Behind us, the sun was beginning to break through the thick overcast, and it felt as if the temperature was warming. I was told, Will said, stopping just short of the mountain's top, that the temples are on the other side of this ridge. He stopped and looked at me. This may be the hardest part. His words sounded ominous to me. Why? I asked. What do you mean? We have to put all the extensions together and keep our energy as strong as possible. The legends say that only if we are able to keep our energy high enough will we be able to see the temples. I nodded and looked down. I was determined to maintain this positive field. Now, go beyond that to acknowledge the Dakini and expect the luminosities. I looked out at the summit just ahead, and Will nodded and led the way forward. When we reached the crest, we could see nothing on the other side except a series of snow-covered peaks and valleys. We surveyed the scene carefully. Over there, Will yelled, pointing to our left. I strained to see. Something at the edge of the crest seemed to be shimmering slightly. When I tried to focus on it directly, all I saw was that the area seemed luminous. But when I looked at it through the corner of my eye, I could tell that the space itself was shimmering. Let's go, Will said. He pulled my arm and we made our way across the deep snow and up to the spot we'd seen. As we walked closer, the area seemed to grow brighter still. Beyond it was a series of huge rocky spires that looked from a distance to be lined up side by side. Upon closer inspection, however, we found that one was set back from the others, leaving a narrow passage that bent around farther to the left and down the slope of the mountain. When we reached the passage, we discovered that there were actually stone steps hewn into the rocks that led the way downward. The steps also appeared luminous and were clear of snow. The Dakini are showing us where to go, Will said, still pulling me along. We ducked through the opening and followed the descending pathway. For more than an hour, we walked down the steps, steadily descending, until the ground leveled off and the steps ended. Over there, Will said, pointing. 200 yards ahead of us appeared to be an old monastery, totally in ruin as if it were thousands of years old. As we walked toward it, the temperature warmed and a misty ground fog rose from the rocks. In front of the monastery, the precipice widened into a wide shelf that cut into the side of the mountain. When we reached the ruins, we carefully made our way through the collapsed walls and large stones until we emerged on the other side. There, we were stopped in our tracks. The rocky surface we were walking on turned to a floor of smooth, flat stones, light amber in color, that were evenly placed onto the ground beneath our feet. I glanced at Will, who was looking straight ahead. In front of us was an intact temple, standing 50 feet high and twice that wide. It was rusty brown with streaks of gray along the joints of the fitted stone walls. On the front were 2 mammoth doors, 15 or 20 feet high. Something moved in the misty fog near the temple. I looked at Will, and he nodded, motioning me to follow him. We walked to within 20 yards of the structure. What was that movement? I asked Will. He gestured with his head toward the area in front of us. Less than 10 feet away was a form of some kind. I strained to focus and finally was able to detect the barest outline of a human figure. It must be one of the adepts who inhabit the temples, Will said. The person is vibrating higher than us. That's why we can only see a hazy shape. As we watched, the shape moved toward the door of the temple and disappeared. Will led the way up to the door. It appeared to be made of some kind of stone, yet when Will pulled it by the carved stone knob, it glided open as though it weighed nothing.